add-on, be able to fetch additional data that you can populate components in the UI with. Okay, cool.
And for example, for me, the first plugin I have was a simple drop-down list, but with nothing on the UI. I use a basic plugin, and I have defined a specific C# type on the activity property. And with this and with the decoration of specific component, I have just on the server side create an HTTP request to another server. And the basic of the communication between the UI and the server, the Elsa server already works and is already done. And I have just implemented a new HTTP request for another request for another server. And I think there is some sample on the documentation or on the GitHub.
Okay.
For this.
If you have access to that URL, then
yeah, I will show you this.
So there is a sample for that, and I would like to look into that as well because I'm curious about how it works. It's in the current release, Andrew. So what we're discussing now is something that was working from I think somewhere 2.4 or something like that. So it's in the 2.8 also available. Hey Sipke.
Hi everyone, good to see you guys
Hello.
who started. I was a little bit late, sorry.
No problem.
All right, let me share my screen. How's everyone doing?
Sorry, I couldn't find the button for the mic. I'm good. But you know that because I saw you today.
I just saw Frans.
Yeah.
All right, so I added a couple of topics that I would like to talk about. Does any one of you have any topics to add?
Me not, Andrew not.
No.
No. All right, then let's just dive in. Yeah, so I just wanted to give a brief update on what I've been working on and what my current focus is, which is sorry, come again?
Are you sharing your screen?
I think I am. Can you guys see my screen or nothing?
Nothing.
All right, let me try. So a couple of topics I wanted to talk about are documentation that I started for Elsa 3. Also as an exercise to see from a beginner's point of view what is missing. And actually one of the first things that I think is missing is a good story about protecting your API endpoints. We don't have it in Elsa 2. There is a way to do it, but it's not properly documented. So I want to fix that for Elsa 3 from the get-go. So as a new user of Elsa 3, when you start it from your Visual Studio or whatever IDE you're using, I want the API endpoints to be protected by default and give the developer an option to opt out of secured API endpoints, but by default it should be enabled. And also, not only should it be enabled, it should also be easy for the developer to get started with Elsa without first having to create an access token and then having to somehow include it in the outgoing HTTP calls from the dashboard, because also from the dashboard's point of view, the user should be able to just start using it, even if it means we require the user to log in using a predetermined login, a username and password. For example, what RabbitMQ does, when you start RabbitMQ from a container or you install it locally, by default there will be a user called guest and the password is the same. Similarly, we could do that for Elsa or provide a very easy way to configure an administrator user from app settings, which can be dangerous because we don't want users to actually start adding clear text passwords to app settings, right? Of course, users should do it from the environment, but not all IDEs support providing secrets without committing it to Git, although Visual Studio has user secrets, I think, and Rider, of course, has profiles. Project profiles that store the secrets elsewhere outside of your project, or at least it's not committed to Git by default. So even better, I think, would be to just either go with the default administrative account like guest or admin, or even better, as soon as you start dashboard, you are presented with a setup screen. So not even a login screen, that will be once you have initialized your system, but if this is the first time you're signing in, then maybe it should just display a setup screen so that you can pick and choose your own username and password, which is the most safe way of doing those things. So I'm thinking about these things. I haven't put it in stone yet. What I did start working on is the foundations of having secured APIs, and I would like to walk you through the code a little bit of the way it's gonna look like from a security point of view when working with Elsa APIs. And the first thing you will notice is this line here, add fast endpoints. So Elsa 3 will not be using regular MVC controllers, but it will be using a library called fast endpoints, which is a very, very nice small library that makes it very easy to make the authentication story programmable, or at least configurable from the user's point of view. It's also a simpler way. And just to show you an example, let's take a look at the Elsa Workflows API project. So this is a class library. It's in Elsa speak, it's a module. And what makes this a module, it's just the fact that it's a class library and it has a features folder, and it exposes a class called, in this case, Workflows API feature. What features do in Elsa is just register their services, that whenever you enable this feature, when you choose to use this feature, it will install these dependencies or these services. And the nice thing about that is that if a given feature can declare dependencies on other features, so that from the user's point of view, if you wanted to use a specific feature like Quartz, and let's say Quartz depends on Elsa scheduling, for example, those features will be registered automatically with proper defaults, but every feature that exposes configuration can be configured from your startup, or in .NET 6 there's no longer a startup, of course, from the program files where you configure your services. So just to give you an example, here we see a big code block that adds all sorts of things like activities, and it declares what features is going to be used and other features. When you start from the box, all you should have to do is just say add Elsa, and that's it. And then you can forget about all of these things. And the idea is that what this will do, it will just install the most commonly used services that are useful for most common scenarios. And maybe there will be an add Elsa core that installs a bare bones version of Elsa in terms of DI services. And then you can specifically choose what you want to add as well. But anyway, that's a small tangent on Elsa features. What I wanted to talk about is fast endpoints. Here I'm adding the services necessary for fast endpoints. Yeah, so this is from that library. And the way an endpoint looks, that's what I wanted to show, is an example here. Let's say you have an endpoint to list all of the activity types available to the system. The way it works is you implement a class, or you create a class that derives from endpoint. So this is a specific endpoint, but from the fast endpoint library, it would just be an endpoint. And then because I don't accept a request here, just inherit from endpoint without request. So it's a specific subtype. You can forget about the details for now, but it's a class that you inherit from, and it allows you to configure its route using a configure method. And this is the point I'm getting to, is you programmatically configure the permissions. And this could be roles that are required for the user to have in order to invoke this endpoint, or it could be a policy name or a set of policies that the user must adhere to. And this is an or expression, if you will. So the user needs to match either the first policy, let's say policy 1, or policy 2, etc. And the same goes for roles, and the same goes for permissions. Permissions is the one I think is the most useful for Elsa, which is then used as a class library, of course, because this way, when using permissions, it's up to the application developer or the Elsa implementer to determine what users get what permissions. And I'm using wildcards here, so let me fix this. Let me undo my changes for a second. So here I can provide a list of permissions that the user requires. So for all users, users that have the star permission can do anything. And that's actually implemented in this method here. So this is a custom base class that itself inherits from fast endpoint based classes. But what it's doing here, it's doing a couple of things. It's checking if security is enabled. So this is a static property that Elsa implementer can disable or enable. If security is disabled, anonymous requests are allowed for all of the endpoints. This is for convenience. It's an opt-out feature. So you have to opt out of security. So you can't by accident deploy to production without security. So that's a safety measure. But if you want to troubleshoot or just quickly get going with Elsa on your local machine, you can set this flag to false from your program file. But by default, it will be enabled, which means that any request requires at least the star asterisk. That's this constant here. It's the star, the asterisk symbol. So the user needs to have that permission, or whatever permission was provided from the child class. In this example, read star or read activity descriptors. So this gives you a very granular control over what endpoints can be accessed by which users. Of course, the challenge will also be in the dashboard application, which needs to visually reflect what the user can and cannot do, which should be okay to do since these are part of a claim called permissions. So you have to imagine when you sign in as a user, you will get back an access token, which is an encoded, base64 encoded JWT or JWT token that carries a permission claim, which itself contains a value, which is an array of your permissions. And then the client can read those permissions, and based on the provided permissions, certain UI elements will be enabled or disabled. So for example, if you don't have the publish workflow definitions permission, the button will be grayed out or not available at all. So this is what I'm prototyping and experimenting with, and see what works well from both the user's perspective as well as the Elsa implementer's perspective and module developers that are looking to extend the system, because this is important. The system needs to be extensible. Yeah, so let me remove this. So in any case, I recommend checking out the Fast Endpoints library. Very feature rich, and it serves all of the feature requirements that I have for the Elsa API endpoints. And another nice thing is that it's also easier to control what endpoints you actually register or which you don't want to register, because Elsa will ship out of the box with many of these packages. Some of them have API endpoints like activity definitions, like Elsa Workflows API, and then there's also the labels module, which also exposes endpoints. But let's say the Elsa implementer isn't going to use the labels module. So therefore, first of all, when the developer doesn't even reference the labels packets, the endpoints won't be exposed. So that's an easy way of not exposing labels endpoints. But let's imagine they do for some reason reference the packets, but they want to disable the endpoints. They can do so from program by configuring the endpoint discovery options. So this library lets you control the endpoint discovery process so that you can exclude certain packages. This was a request from someone for Elsa too, and it's possible to do with ASP.NET MVC APIs by removing certain, it's not called areas, but I forgot the name, I'm blanking on the name, but there's a way to opt out of it, but it's a little bit complicated. I think this is easier, and it doesn't conflict with controllers. So if the Elsa implementer also expose their own controllers, they can do so, and it should not interfere, and they can then also configure their controllers to use a different JSON serializer, for example, compared to the JSON serializer used by Fast Endpoints. So yeah, so that's API secure API endpoints that are secure out of the box. Currently, I'm working on, as I mentioned, the foundation so that both the front end and the back end are secure. The back end is almost done, and the front end I just started working on. And it will have a security context or an authentication context where modules can read current token from, including the user's name, which could be nice if we are able to display the user name in the toolbar, for example. But also it's extensible, which means out of the box we may have an Elsa identity module which is very basic. It will just allow the user to create users, manage users, and assign roles, and roles themselves can have permissions, and that's it. Or they can have Auth0 integration, for example, and not even use local users, but just rely on Auth0 for all of their user management, including authentication. In which case, there will not be a login screen exposed by Elsa itself, which would, by the way, be its own little module using a plugin in the front end, but instead the user would be redirected to Auth0's login page where the user logs in, and then Auth0 redirects the sign-in user back to the Elsa dashboard, at which point they are logged in, but using the same security entities that I have in place there, the same primitives. Any questions about that? I know it's a lot. I've been rambling on.
Will it be possible to assign permissions on individual items? For example, I want to give a user a permission to edit a certain workflow, but they will have only read-only access for other workflows. Would that be possible with the Elsa 3, what you are thinking about right now?
Good question. I haven't actually thought about that, but it's a very relevant question. And I think the answer should be yes. It should at least be possible. Maybe not out of the box from this work, but it should lay the foundation to allow that, because in order to assign permissions to a workflow and make it executable. At the core of Elsa, I don't think it should have any knowledge of users or permissions, but it should be extensible so that let's say a permissions module that implements this feature that cooperates with the Elsa identity module, let's say if that were a module, then that should be possible, or even it should be part of the Elsa identity module potentially. So I'll give it some thought, but I think that should be made possible. And we could even take it a step further so that not only at the workflow level, but maybe even on certain activities that can take advantage of some of the security primitives. Although in this case, it's more about the user managing workflow, so maybe not that relevant. All right, another thing I've been working on, well, it's been 2 weeks already since I worked on this, but this is about databaseless execution. And just to explain what I mean by that is I want the user to be able to execute workflows that do not persist workflow instances in the database. Not automatically or not necessarily. So the user should have an option of whether that's the case or not. And the reason is if you have a scenario where you have workflows that just need to do a lot of work fast, maybe many times, and you don't really care about persisting the state of those workflow executions, we should offer the option of not even storing those things. Maybe you don't care about the workflow instance object stored in the database because maybe your workflows are driven by some Kafka queue. So let's imagine all of the events that drive workflows happen by reading from a Kafka queue. So some producer sends messages to a queue, which is being processed and then drives a bunch of workflows. Now let's say a workflow at some point crashes, but the message is still there in Kafka, so maybe it could be replayed. So in this way you already have some state there that allows you to retry certain workflows. That could be one scenario. Another scenario could be where as workflows execute, at certain stages they create and store a snapshot of Kafka. So that's another way of persisting your workflow instances or some aspect of it. So my point is it should be more flexible. So maybe in those scenarios you don't want to create workflow instance objects before executing workflow, which is the case in Elsa 2. And then depending on your workflow setting, it will update the workflow instance document at every step of the way, or when it encounters a blocking activity. That's also a suspension point, which automatically results in storing the workflow instance into the database. You don't have much control over that in Elsa 2. In Elsa 3, you should have different options, more control over when it's stored. And that's the DB-less execution branch that I'm working on, where by default it's not stored, or at least you can choose that it's not stored by default. And this relies, of course, heavily on the actor model as implemented by Proto-Actor. But this is in its early stages, so it's still very experimental. Yeah, so that's this one. And as I mentioned, I started working on documentation to identify any missing gaps, and that led me to the API secure endpoints. Let me show you what template I found for the documentation side. A popular demand was light mode and dark mode. I think very important to have. So it's there. This is, by the way, based on a Tailwind template, which is pretty cool. So if you go to tailwindui.com, there's a template section, which is fairly new. And they have pretty amazing templates using Tailwind UI or Tailwind CSS classes. But these templates, they're beautiful. And the one for the documentation is Syntax. So this is specifically designed for documentation websites. And I'll show a live preview. So it has a search feature built in. It has a nice section here on the left. And another nice aspect of this is the fact that the documentation is written in Markdown. So it uses some Next.js module that turns Markdown into a beautifully styled pages. So yeah, I started just with the homepage, so a lot of work has yet to be done. As I mentioned, I'm also using this as an exercise to see what does the story look like for starters of Elsa 3. What are the missing gaps for these initial steps, and we'll build on top of that and really dig into the details. One critique I receive often on the current Elsa documentation is it can be a bit confusing on how to start, even though there's a few quick starts. What's not so clear is when do you use which scenario. What's not always clear is that Elsa can be used in any kind of .NET application, right? So it can be used in a console application, could be used in an ASP.NET Core application, which is the most common case, I think. But it could also be used in WPF or Windows services or even MAUI apps should be possible, because anywhere .NET runs, Elsa can run as well. I want to try and start documentation more from a top-down level, so that you start with an overview and then there's various paths you can dig into. And of course, any feedback and thoughts on you probably have read some of the documentation, came across issues or very aware of the missing topics. That's something I want to tackle as well. But this is a start.
Probably we get a lot of question answers and issues. We arrive at the solutions there, but maybe they get buried. So maybe a good idea is that whenever we arrive at a certain solution or demo, we try to contribute it to the documentation.
Oh, that would be great. Yeah.
So probably in the same way that we are contributing to the source code, if we can also try to promote contributing solutions to the documentation, that could also help enrich, rather than make it as a burden, someone has to go and update all the documents, which we know as developers, it's always a weight on us. So,
yeah, it feels so unproductive to work on documentation, but the funny thing is it's one of the most productive things you can do, because so many people benefit just from that nugget of knowledge shared in documentation. Yeah. It's
so probably let's try to make some contribution model or PRs that we can try to add to the documentation itself.
That's a great idea. I love that. Yeah, and it's also good to try and make it a habit to, instead of directly answering questions, especially if those questions are asked more frequently, to create a topic, even if it's a temporary guide or a hint or a tip section, doesn't matter. Try and add it here and then share a link to that page. And it doesn't have to be perfect immediately. We can improve it over time, because that's, I guess, the reason why it's easier for me, at least, to directly answer in Discord or on GitHub or Stack Overflow, because the answer doesn't need to be polished, right? You can just give a few pointers. It doesn't have to be complete. But it always seems to me that when you start adding documentation, it needs to be more polished or more complete, at least. And that's also a barrier to actually do it. But maybe we should have some sort of section where, even if it's just a quick pointer, at least it's more helpful, because we can point to it. So yeah, so those are the challenges of maintaining an open source project and its documentation. Yeah, so I guess that's my update for now. And tomorrow I will continue with the API endpoints, specifically the front end. And I'm probably going to try and pace myself and not go ahead and implement a setup wizard, but just stick with the basics and at the very least provide a UI with a login screen for starters. It's a shame that Gurkan isn't here, because he's been working on the versioning UI. So in Elsa 2 we have versioning, which allows the user to roll back to all the versions of workflow definitions, and he ported that to Elsa 3. I was hoping we could look at a demo, but unfortunately he couldn't make it today. But maybe next week.
Any chance to get the demo on the credential manager?
I haven't tried it myself, but we could just fire it up and see how far it gets us. We still have a couple of minutes.
And I think today also there was some similar question about running Elsa behind the proxy.
I saw that question, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so when we click on add new, we can add a new secret of a given type. So let's say we want a bearer token. Let's call it GitHub access token. So that's the secret's name, the type, authorization. So this seems to be a read-only field, and then I imagine this to be the value. So this could come from settings or a value hardcode here. So let's say we use this value, save. All right, so now we have a secret called GitHub access token. And then presumably we should be able to add an HTTP request activity using that secret, so instead of hard-coding the authorization header value. So let's see if that's true. Send HTTP request. Let's say we invoke a GitHub API endpoint. Then in advanced, there's authorization. And then, okay, so the module, the secrets module, replaced the authorization field with a dropdown so that you can pick one of the secrets. So that's the basic idea. And I imagine the same way it would work for SQL connection strings. So let's say we have a application DB connection string. This is the type. So here, personally, I don't like this very much, but maybe because I'm a developer used to copy and pasting connection strings. Here I have to individually fill out every component, but that's the way it is right now. So data source would be, let's say, localhost, maybe my app database, true or yes, I don't know, yes. Whatever. Our password I think should be this should be a password field, not clear text. But anyway, let's try it like this. So now we have a secret of type MS SQL Server, and this I think works together with one of the SQL activities. So here's SQL, execute SQL query, database, query connection string. Okay, so this one seems to be empty. So I would expect that to be filled out. Could be a bug. Yeah, we can try that. Yeah, you're right. So you need to refresh. Yeah.
And probably this is one of the use cases where you want the credential manager to be with the administrator, where the users will just use the credentials without even knowing the details.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
authorization.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Because if without that requirement, we would just define those secrets using environment variables, for example, and configure the system to use those things. And if an activity needed to access a connection string from an activity, we would use a JavaScript expression to read that secret from the environment or through some configuration API. But this is
right
user oriented. Yeah, there's a get config JavaScript function that can read from not app settings, but it will read from the .NET configuration API, and I think it's called getConfig. But it's probably not enabled by default. You need to set a script option called enable configuration access. And I think this is this of course is a boolean. If it's true, then it will add getConfig, and as you can look at the implementation, it will get the configuration section that you provide as an argument and then a value.
Yeah, I wasn't aware this is possible. This is interesting.
Yeah, it can be very helpful. I'm actually using this with a customer.
Because I think I remember Tommy was commenting whether this getConfig should be exposed in autocomplete.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and now it will be exposed if this is enabled. Let's see. I think he's the one who added this line. All right. Well, my time's up. Unless there's any urgent questions or topics, let's pick this up next week.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.